You were never the woman for my future." Alexander Whitmore spat those words at his wife on a Manhattan sidewalk, dropped a suitcase at her feet, and walked away without looking back, never imagining that 3 years later he'd stand frozen in a ballroom, watching that same broken woman descend a golden staircase as the queen of the most powerful charity gala in New York, his mistress clinging to his arm, his champagne glass shattering across the marble floor. He came tonight to flaunt his new life. He had no idea he was about to watch his old one rise from the ashes and burn everything he built to the ground. If this story pulls you in, hit subscribe and follow me to the end. And drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Alexander Whitmore stood in front of the mirror in his penthouse dressing room, adjusting his black bow tie with the calm precision of a man who believed the world belonged to him. Behind him, Madison Blake twirled once in her shimmering silver gown, admiring her reflection, admiring herself, admiring the life she had stolen without ever earning it. "Tonight is important," Alexander said, not looking at her, only at himself. "The Liberty Crown Gala is where deals are made before contracts are even signed. Every investor who matters will be in that room." Madison smiled, running her fingers along the diamond necklace resting on her collarbone. A necklace Alexander had bought her only 2 weeks earlier, a necklace that cost more than most people made in 5 years. "I know how to work a room, Alexander," she said sweetly. "I've been practicing my whole life." He almost laughed. Almost. Because it was true. Madison had spent her entire life practicing how to be seen, how to be wanted, how to attach herself to power like a vine climbing the tallest tree in the forest. She didn't build anything. She simply climbed onto what already existed. Alexander didn't mind. He liked that about her, unlike Victoria. Unlike Victoria, who used to ask him uncomfortable questions about contracts. Unlike Victoria, who used to frown at his aggressive business decisions. Unlike Victoria, who used to tell him gently but firmly, "Alexander, I don't think we should do this deal. Something feels wrong." He hated remembering her voice. He hated remembering her at all. 3 years should have been enough to erase a person completely. And for the most part, it had worked. Victoria Sterling had vanished from his life so thoroughly that sometimes, when people asked about his past, he almost forgot her name came before Madison's. Almost. "You look distracted," Madison said, stepping closer, resting a manicured hand against his chest. "Thinking about business?" "Always," Alexander said, forcing a smile. "Tonight, we walk in like we own the room, because soon we will." Outside, a black limousine waited beneath the golden lights of Manhattan. The chauffeur opened the door with practiced silence, and Alexander stepped out first, extending his hand for Madison like a king presenting his newest jewel to the kingdom. Cameras erupted the moment they appeared on the red carpet outside the Hamilton estate. "Alexander, Alexander, over here!" "Madison, is that a new necklace? Who designed it?" "Are congratulations in order? Engagement rumors have been swirling for weeks." Alexander squeezed Madison's waist and smiled the smile that had graced 100 magazine covers. Confident, untouchable. The smile of a man who believed nothing could shake him. "We'll see," he said smoothly to the reporters, letting the ambiguity hang deliciously in the air. "Tonight isn't about announcements. Tonight is about celebration." Madison beamed beside him, soaking in every flash, every whispered comment, every ounce of attention like sunlight after a long winter. Inside, the Hamilton Estate ballroom glittered like something out of a fairy tale, gone cold and expensive. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from towering ceilings. Champagne flowed from crystal fountains. Senators mingled with celebrities. Billionaires exchanged handshakes worth more than small nations. Alexander moved through the crowd like he was born for rooms like this, because, in his mind, he was. "Alexander Whitmore," said a silver-haired man extending his hand. "Been hearing great things about Whitmore Global's expansion." "Robert," Alexander said warmly, shaking the man's hand with practiced firmness. "You should have heard even better things. We're closing the Halstead acquisition by next quarter." "Impressive," Robert said, though his eyes flicked briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Madison. "And your lovely companion?" Madison Blake, Alexander said proudly. The future, perhaps. Madison extended her hand elegantly, her smile never faltering, her performance flawless. They moved from conversation to conversation, from handshake to handshake, and with every interaction, Alexander felt the familiar rush of power surging through his veins. This was who he was. This was who he had built himself into. A man who started with nothing and clawed his way into rooms like this one. He almost forgot, that he hadn't clawed his way here alone. "Have you heard about tonight's host?" a woman in an emerald gown asked, sipping champagne beside him. "Nobody knows her real identity. They just call her the Queen of the Phoenix Foundation." Alexander raised an eyebrow, mildly curious but mostly dismissive. Probably some socialite who inherited a fortune and decided to play philanthropist for the tax write-off. The woman laughed. "Maybe, but she's raised over $400 million for displaced families in the last 2 years alone. Half the room owes her favors they haven't even collected yet." "Then I should introduce myself," Alexander said, already scanning the crowd for opportunity, already calculating how a woman with that kind of influence could benefit Whitmore Global. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea what was coming. Madison excused herself to the powder room, leaving Alexander alone at the edge of a conversation about hedge funds he barely cared about. His mind wandered, as it often did in rooms like this, toward the next deal, the next headline, the next milestone that would cement his legacy. He didn't think about her. He never let himself think about her. But somewhere, deep beneath the tailored suit and the practiced confidence, a small, quiet part of him still remembered a woman sitting across a kitchen table at 2 a.m, red pen in hand, circling errors in contracts that would have bankrupted him if she hadn't caught them. He remembered her voice. "Alexander, this clause here, it's dangerous. You need to renegotiate this before you sign." He remembered ignoring her at first. He remembered being wrong and her being right, and the quiet satisfaction on her face that never once turned into arrogance. He remembered throwing all of that away for a woman who currently stood in a bathroom mirror, perfecting her lipstick for cameras that would forget her name in 5 years. But that was a different lifetime. That was a mistake he had buried so deep he almost believed it never happened. Almost. The orchestra shifted into a slower, more elegant piece. The lights along the walls dimmed slightly, a signal that the evening's main program was about to begin. Guests began drifting toward the grand staircase at the center of the ballroom, drawn by an energy that Alexander couldn't quite place, a hush falling over hundreds of powerful people all at once, an anticipation thick enough to touch. "What's happening?" Alexander asked a nearby waiter. "The host is about to speak, sir," the young man said. "Everyone's been waiting all night for this." Alexander chuckled softly to himself. A charity host giving a speech. How quaint. How beneath him, really. He'd sat through 100 of these, tearful appeals for donations wrapped in designer gowns and rehearsed smiles. He reached for a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray, already mentally drafting his exit strategy for right after the speech concluded. Madison returned to his side just as the orchestra fell completely silent. "What did I miss?" she whispered. "Nothing important," Alexander murmured. "Just the charity portion of the evening." The announcer stepped onto the small stage at the base of the staircase, microphone in hand, his voice carrying easily across the hushed ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight at the Liberty Crown Gala. Every dollar raised this evening goes directly toward rebuilding lives shattered by circumstances beyond their control. And now it is my honor, my absolute honor, to introduce the woman who built this foundation from nothing. The woman who, in just 3 years, has become one of the most influential philanthropists in this country." Alexander sipped his champagne, only half listening, his eyes drifting toward the exit signs, calculating how quickly he could slip away once the speech began dragging. "Please welcome the founder and chairwoman of the Phoenix Foundation." The chandeliers dimmed further. A single spotlight ignited at the top of the grand staircase. "Ms. Victoria Sterling." The champagne glass slipped from Alexander's fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and sudden, cutting through the orchestra's opening notes like a gunshot. Every head near him turned. Madison gasped, jumping back from the spray of glass and liquid. But Alexander didn't move. Alexander couldn't move. His entire body had gone rigid, his eyes locked on the top of that staircase, on the woman descending it in a midnight blue gown that moved like liquid silk around her, on the confidence radiating from her like heat from a flame. It was her. It was actually her, Victoria Sterling, his ex-wife. The woman he had discarded 3 years ago like she was nothing. The woman he had told, in this very city, "You were never the woman for my future." The woman he had believed, truly, arrogantly believed, would fade quietly into obscurity, grateful for whatever crumbs of dignity remained after he finished with her. She did not look like a woman who had faded into anything. She looked like a queen. "Alexander!" Madison hissed, gripping his arm. "Alexander, what's wrong with you?" He couldn't answer. His throat had closed completely, his mind racing through 3 years of assumptions, 3 years of certainty that Victoria Sterling had disappeared into irrelevance while he ascended into legend. He had been wrong. He had been catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. Victoria reached the base of the staircase, and the entire ballroom erupted into applause. Genuine, thunderous, reverent applause. Senators clapped. Celebrities clapped. Billionaires who had never clapped for anyone in their lives clapped for her. She smiled, gracious and composed, raising a hand slightly to quiet the room. "Thank you," she said, and her voice, God, her voice, was different, stronger, steadier. Nothing like the soft, hesitant voice Alexander remembered from late nights spent quietly correcting his mistakes while he took all the credit. 3 years ago, Victoria began, her eyes sweeping calmly across the crowd, "I lost everything I thought defined me, my marriage, my home, my sense of who I was supposed to be." Alexander's stomach dropped. She wasn't looking at him. Not yet. But every word felt aimed directly at his chest. "I was told I wasn't good enough," Victoria continued, her voice never wavering, never breaking. "I was told I was too quiet, too ordinary, too much of a burden for someone destined for greater things." Madison's grip on Alexander's arm tightened. "Alexander," she whispered urgently, "is she talking about—" "Quiet," he snapped, sharper than he intended, his eyes never leaving the staircase. "That night," Victoria said, "I made myself a promise. I promised I would never again beg anyone to see my worth. I would build something so undeniable, so impossible to ignore, that worth would no longer be a question anyone could ask." The crowd murmured appreciatively, moved by words they didn't fully understand yet, words that Alexander understood with sickening, complete clarity. "Tonight," Victoria continued, "the Phoenix Foundation has raised over $450 million for families who were told, by circumstance or by cruelty, that they didn't matter." Thunderous applause rippled through the ballroom again. Alexander stood frozen at its edge, broken glass still scattered near his polished shoes, Madison's confused whispers buzzing uselessly beside his ear, his entire understanding of the last 3 years crumbling in real time. He had thought he won. He had thought throwing Victoria away was the moment he became truly powerful, truly free, truly the man he was always meant to be. He was beginning to understand, with dawning horror, that it might have been the single greatest mistake of his life. Victoria finished her speech to a standing ovation. She stepped off the small stage and began moving gracefully through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging warm words with people who clearly adored her, people who had no idea, or perhaps didn't care, that the man standing frozen near the champagne fountain was the husband who once discarded her like garbage. Alexander finally found his legs. "I need to speak with her," he muttered. "Alexander, wait." Madison started, but he was already moving, pushing gently through the crowd, his mind a chaotic storm of disbelief, panic, and something uncomfortably close to fear. He caught up to Victoria near the edge of the dance floor, where she had paused to speak with an elderly senator about infrastructure grants. Alexander waited, awkwardly, painfully, until the senator excused himself and Victoria turned to leave. "Victoria." She stopped. Slowly, deliberately, she turned to face him, and for one suspended moment, Alexander searched her expression for something. Anger, hurt, satisfaction, anything he could recognize, anything he could use. He found nothing but calm, unreadable composure. "Mr. Whitmore," she said evenly, "I wasn't aware you were on tonight's guest list." The formality hit him like a slap. Mr. Whitmore, not Alexander. Not even a flicker of the familiarity 3 years of marriage should have earned. "Victoria, stop," he said, lowering his voice, glancing nervously at nearby guests who had begun subtly watching the exchange. This isn't who you are. The gowns, the foundation, the speech, this isn't you." Victoria tilted her head slightly, something almost like amusement flickering across her composed features. "And which version of me did you know exactly?" she asked quietly. "The one who reviewed your contracts at 2 in the morning, or the one you handed a suitcase to on the sidewalk?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "I left you with nothing." "No," Victoria said, her voice steady, almost gentle in its devastating precision. "You left me with freedom." The words landed harder than anything he expected, harder than anger, harder than tears, because there was no bitterness in her tone at all, only a quiet, unshakable truth that made his 3 years of assumed victory feel suddenly, sickeningly hollow. "I don't understand," Alexander said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his voice actually trembled. "How did you... all of this, the foundation, the money, the..." "You never asked how the company survived that first year after our divorce," Victoria interrupted calmly. "You never wondered how Whitmore Global avoided collapse after the Meridian contract nearly destroyed you. You were too busy believing your success belonged entirely to you." Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you saying?" Victoria's eyes, calm and steady, held his without flinching. "I'm saying you should be more careful about which mistakes you assume are buried, Alexander." Before he could respond, before he could even process the full weight of her words, Madison appeared at his side, her earlier confusion replaced now with sharp, defensive suspicion. "Is there a problem here?" Madison asked, looping her arm possessively through Alexander's, her eyes narrowing at Victoria with obvious territorial hostility. Victoria's gaze shifted calmly to Madison, assessing her with the same detached composure she'd shown Alexander. "No problem at all," Victoria said smoothly. "I was simply congratulating Mr. Whitmore on his evening." "That's your ex-wife?" Madison whispered to Alexander, loud enough that several nearby guests clearly heard, their heads turning with poorly concealed interest. Alexander said nothing. He couldn't. He was too busy watching Victoria's face for any hint of the vulnerability he had counted on. Any crack in her composure that would confirm his old, comfortable belief that she had never truly recovered from what he did to her. There was none. "If you'll excuse me," Victoria said politely, "I have other guests to attend to." She walked away without waiting for a response, her midnight blue gown trailing behind her like a shadow that refused to be ignored, leaving Alexander standing frozen in the middle of the ballroom with his mistress on his arm and his entire sense of reality collapsing quietly around him. "Alexander," Madison said, her voice tight with irritation now rather than confusion, "what exactly happened between you two? Because that woman did not look broken." Alexander swallowed hard, watching Victoria's retreating figure disappear into the crowd of admirers waiting to speak with her. "She was supposed to be," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She was supposed to be broken." Across the ballroom, unnoticed by either of them, a man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit watched the entire exchange with quiet interest. He made a small note on his phone, glanced briefly toward Victoria's retreating figure, and slipped discreetly toward the private meeting rooms at the rear of the estate. He was one of Whitmore Global's largest silent investors, and what he had just witnessed had raised questions he intended to have answered before the night ended. Alexander, still reeling, still trying to process the impossible reality standing 30 feet away from him in a designer gown, had no idea that his carefully constructed empire had just begun its first, quiet crack. He thought the worst part of the evening was behind him. He was wrong, because Victoria Sterling hadn't simply come to host a gala. She had come with proof. And within hours, everything Alexander Whitmore had spent 3 years building was about to collapse in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Not because of revenge, not because of anger, but because of a truth he had spent 3 years desperately hoping would stay buried. The night was far from over, and Alexander Whitmore, for the first time in his entire adult life, had absolutely no idea what was coming next. The man in the charcoal suit was named Richard Cole, and he had not built his fortune by ignoring moments like the one he had just witnessed. He moved through the private corridor behind the ballroom with quiet, unhurried steps, already dialing a number on his phone before he reached the meeting room door. "It's Cole," he said when the call connected. "I need everything you have on Victoria Sterling, tonight, not tomorrow." On the other end of the line, his assistant hesitated. "Sir, do you mean the Phoenix Foundation woman?" "I mean Alexander Whitmore's ex-wife," Richard said flatly. "And I want to know why she looked at him tonight like she already knew something the rest of us don't." He hung up before his assistant could respond, slipping the phone back into his jacket pocket, his mind already turning over calculations far more dangerous than anything happening on the dance floor. Back in the ballroom, Alexander stood rigid beside Madison, his champagne long forgotten, his confidence cracked in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Around him, the party continued exactly as it had before: laughter, music, the clink of crystal glasses. But for Alexander, the entire room had shifted into something unfamiliar and threatening. "Alexander," Madison's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, sharp and impatient. "You're being ridiculous. It's a party. She's just some woman from your past playing dress-up with rich people's money." Alexander turned to her slowly, and for the first time that evening, he actually looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not comfort, not partnership, but a woman entirely focused on how his panic might inconvenience her night. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "Victoria doesn't do anything without a reason. She never has." "So she used to organize your sock drawer," Madison snapped. "That doesn't make her some criminal mastermind." Alexander said nothing. He couldn't explain to Madison, couldn't explain to anyone really, what it had felt like standing across from Victoria and seeing absolutely nothing he recognized. Not weakness, not longing, not even anger, just calm, terrifying certainty. Nearby, 2 women in elegant gowns whispered behind champagne flutes, their voices carrying just enough for Alexander to catch fragments. "Heard she funded the entire East Wing renovation at Lincoln Memorial Hospital. Personally met with the mayor twice this year. They say she turned down a seat on 3 different corporate boards because she wanted to stay independent." Every sentence landed like another small stone added to the growing weight in Alexander's chest. This wasn't the Victoria he remembered. This wasn't the quiet woman who used to sit beside him at dinner parties, nodding politely while he took credit for decisions she had quietly guided. This was someone else entirely, someone he didn't recognize, someone who terrified him precisely because he could no longer predict her. "Excuse me," said a voice behind him. Alexander turned to find a young event coordinator holding a small tablet, her expression polite but professional. "Mr. Whitmore, Miss Sterling would like to know if you and your guest will be staying for the private donor reception afterward. Seating needs to be finalized." Alexander blinked. "She's inviting me?" "She said all major industry guests are welcome," the coordinator said simply, though something in her careful phrasing suggested she'd been instructed to say exactly that and nothing more. Madison brightened immediately, sensing opportunity where Alexander sensed only danger. "Of course we'll stay," she said quickly, before Alexander could answer. "We wouldn't miss it." The coordinator nodded and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Alexander staring after her with a growing, uneasy suspicion that he had just walked directly into something Victoria had already planned 3 moves ahead. "Why would you say yes?" he hissed at Madison once they were alone again. "Because major donors and CEOs will be there," Madison said, as if the answer were obvious. "Because networking with people like that is exactly what you said we came here to do." Alexander opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. She wasn't wrong, and despite every alarm bell ringing in the back of his mind, some old, stubborn part of him, the part that had built an empire from nothing, the part that refused to believe any woman, especially Victoria, could outmaneuver him, insisted that whatever Victoria was planning, he could handle it. He would soon learn how wrong that assumption was. The private reception took place in a smaller room adjacent to the main ballroom. elegant but intimate, with only 40 or 50 of the evening's most influential guests seated around round tables draped in ivory linen. Soft candlelight replaced the chandeliers. A string quartet played quietly in the corner, and at the head table, seated with effortless composure, was Victoria. Alexander and Madison were seated 3 tables away, close enough to see her, far enough to feel deliberately excluded from her immediate circle. Alexander noticed the placement immediately and understood, with grudging respect, that nothing about tonight's seating chart was accidental. Dinner proceeded with polite conversation, forced laughter, and the occasional pointed glance from guests who clearly knew exactly who Alexander was and exactly what had happened between him and their host. He felt it building around him like pressure before a storm. The whispers, the sideways glances, the quiet, cruel amusement of powerful people watching a fellow powerful person squirm. Halfway through the main course, Robert, the silver-haired investor Alexander had spoken with earlier, leaned toward him from the neighboring table. "Quite a woman, isn't she?" Robert said, swirling his wine with practiced casualness. "Victoria Sterling. Word is she turned a $200,000 personal investment into the fastest-growing philanthropic foundation on the East Coast in under 3 years." "Impressive," Alexander said tightly, forcing the word through clenched teeth. "Especially impressive," Robert continued, his eyes flicking meaningfully toward Alexander, "considering she started with almost nothing. No family money, no connections, just her own financial instincts." He paused, taking a slow sip of wine. "Makes you wonder where someone develops instincts like that." Alexander's stomach tightened. He recognized the tone. Robert wasn't simply making conversation. Robert was probing, testing, searching for a reaction. And Alexander realized, with growing dread, that people were already starting to ask questions he desperately did not want answered. "She's always been sharp," Alexander said carefully, forcing a diplomatic smile. "I'm glad she found her path." "Her path," Robert repeated slowly, something knowing flickering behind his eyes. Interesting way to put it. Before Alexander could respond, a soft chime rang through the room, and all conversation gradually quieted. Victoria rose from her seat at the head table, unhurried, composed, every movement deliberate. "Thank you all for staying," she said, her voice carrying easily without amplification. "I promise I won't keep you much longer, but I wanted to share something with this particular group tonight, something I haven't shared publicly yet." Alexander felt Madison's hand tighten around his beneath the table. "3 years ago," Victoria began, "I made a discovery that changed the direction of my entire life. Not something dramatic, not something anyone would have noticed at the time. Just a single financial irregularity buried inside thousands of pages of paperwork in a company I used to know very well." The room remained politely attentive, most guests assuming this was simply another chapter in her inspirational origin story. Alexander, however, felt every muscle in his body go rigid. "I almost ignored it," Victoria continued. "It would have been easy to. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. I had no obligation to anyone connected to that company. But something told me to keep the documents, to keep copies, just in case." Her eyes swept slowly across the room, and for one unbearable second, they landed directly on Alexander. "Just in case," she repeated softly, "someone tried to convince the world that ordinary, quiet women don't notice things." A ripple of quiet, confused laughter moved through the crowd, most guests interpreting her words as a graceful, empowering anecdote rather than the direct, surgical threat Alexander understood it to be. He sat frozen, his heartbeat pounding so loudly he was certain someone nearby could hear it. "Anyway," Victoria said, her tone shifting smoothly back into warm hostess mode, "that's a story for another time. Tonight is about celebration, not old business." She raised her glass, to second chances, the ones we build for ourselves when no one else believes we deserve them. The room raised their glasses in unison, a chorus of clinking crystal and murmured toasts. Alexander lifted his glass mechanically, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly, his mind racing through every possible document, every possible irregularity Victoria could have discovered during their marriage. And then it hit him. The Halstead contracts. 3 years ago, during the final chaotic months of their marriage, Alexander had rushed through a series of aggressive acquisitions, cutting corners, shifting funds between accounts in ways that were, at best, ethically questionable, and at worst, deeply illegal. Victoria had reviewed those documents. Victoria had access to those documents. Victoria had warned him repeatedly that what he was doing could destroy him if it ever came to light. He hadn't listened. He had told her it wasn't her concern anymore, that she was overstepping, that she needed to trust him. She had trusted him enough to keep quiet, but she had never promised to stay quiet forever. "Alexander." Madison's whisper snapped him back to the present, her nails digging slightly into his arm. "You're white as a sheet." "What is she talking about?" "Nothing," Alexander said quickly, too quickly. "Old business. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing, and some primal, panicked instinct deep inside him understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that Victoria Sterling had not spent 3 years building a $400 million foundation out of forgiveness. She had built it out of preparation. Dinner concluded shortly after, guests slowly rising, exchanging final pleasantries, drifting toward the exits in small, satisfied clusters. Alexander remained seated for a long moment, watching Victoria move gracefully through departing guests, shaking hands, accepting praise, playing her role flawlessly. "I need to talk to her again," Alexander muttered, half to himself. "Alexander, it's late," Madison said, checking her phone with obvious irritation. "We have the Halstead call first thing tomorrow morning. Can we please just go home?" The mention of Halstead sent another cold wave through Alexander's chest. "You go ahead," he said. "Have the car take you home. I'll follow shortly." Madison stared at him, something shifting behind her carefully made-up eyes. Not concern exactly, but calculation, the same calculation Alexander himself specialized in. "This is about her, isn't it? Your ex-wife?" "It's about protecting everything we've built," Alexander said, his voice low and urgent. "Please, Madison, just go home." She hesitated a moment longer, then turned sharply on her heel and walked toward the exit without another word, her silver gown catching the candlelight one final time before she disappeared through the doors. Alexander waited until the room had nearly emptied before approaching Victoria again. She stood near the head table, speaking quietly with the event coordinator, reviewing something on a tablet with the focused efficiency of someone who had built an entire empire on attention to detail. "Victoria." She looked up, unsurprised, as though she had been expecting him. "You should go home to your fiancé, Alexander," she said calmly. "It's getting late." "She's not my fiancé," Alexander said, then immediately regretted revealing even that small, unnecessary detail. "Interesting," Victoria said, tilting her head slightly. The tabloids seemed quite convinced. "Victoria, please." His voice cracked slightly, something raw slipping through the polished exterior he'd maintained all evening. "What exactly are you planning? What documents were you talking about?" Victoria studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally setting down the tablet and folding her hands in front of her. "Do you remember the Meridian merger?" she asked quietly. Alexander's blood ran cold. That was 5 years ago. That deal never even closed. "No," Victoria agreed. "But the shell accounts you created to shift liability away from Whitmore Global during that failed negotiation, those never closed either. They just sat there, quietly, waiting." "How do you—" Alexander started, then stopped himself, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. "You kept copies, back then, before we even divorced." "I kept copies of everything," Victoria said simply. "Every contract, every account statement, every email you asked me to review at 2 a.m. because you trusted my judgment more than your own lawyers." "Why?" Alexander demanded, his voice tight with disbelief and something dangerously close to panic. "Why would you keep any of it? We were married. You thought I was harmless," Victoria interrupted, her voice still calm, still steady, but carrying an edge now that hadn't been there before. "You thought I was too quiet, too ordinary, too unimportant to matter once you decided I was no longer useful to your image." Alexander said nothing, the truth of her words settling over him like a physical weight. "I kept everything," Victoria continued, because some part of me always suspected that a man capable of discarding his wife on a sidewalk with a suitcase was also capable of far worse things when no one was watching. I hoped I was wrong. And were you? Alexander asked quietly, already knowing the answer. Victoria's silence was answer enough. Victoria, listen to me, Alexander said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. Whatever you found, whatever you think you found, I can explain it. Business is complicated. Decisions get made under pressure that don't always look clean from the outside. I'm not interested in explanations, Alexander, Victoria said. I spent 3 years of my marriage explaining your decisions to lawyers, investors, and board members who trusted your judgment far more than they should have. I'm done explaining you to anyone. Then what do you want? Alexander asked, desperation finally breaking through his composure entirely. Money? Revenge? Tell me what you want and we can— I don't want anything from you, Victoria said, cutting him off with quiet finality. That's the part you still don't understand, even now. This was never about you, Alexander. It stopped being about you the moment I walked away from that apartment 3 years ago. Then why keep the documents? Alexander pressed. Why bring me here tonight? Why any of this? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting briefly toward the empty ballroom beyond the doorway, filled now with nothing but the faint echo of departed guests and the soft hum of cleanup crews beginning their work. Because tomorrow morning, she said finally, federal investigators are opening a formal inquiry into Whitmore Global's financial practices over the past 5 years. And I decided a long time ago that when that day came, I wanted you to understand exactly why it was happening and exactly who made sure it did. The floor seemed to shift beneath Alexander's feet. You reported me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You actually reported me. I reported evidence of fraud, Victoria corrected calmly. What happens next isn't up to me anymore. It's up to the law. After everything I gave you, Alexander started, anger finally cutting through his panic. You gave me nothing, Alexander, Victoria interrupted, her voice sharpening for the first time all evening, cutting through his sentence like a blade. I built everything you have. I reviewed every contract that kept this company standing. I caught every mistake that would have destroyed you years before you became successful enough to believe you didn't need me anymore. Alexander opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. And when you finally decided I had become inconvenient, Victoria continued, you didn't just leave me, you erased me. You told the world I was nothing. You told our friends, our family, every reporter who asked, that I was simply a phase you outgrew on your way to becoming successful. Her voice remained steady, but something fierce burned quietly beneath the surface now, 3 years of controlled composure finally cracking just enough to reveal the depth of what she had carried silently since that night. So I let you believe it, Victoria said. I let the entire world believe it, because it was easier for you to underestimate me than to face what I actually knew. Alexander stared at her, and for the first time since the champagne glass shattered against the marble floor hours earlier, he understood, completely, irreversibly understood, that he had not simply lost an argument tonight. He had lost everything. Victoria, please, he said, his voice breaking entirely now, stripped of every ounce of the confidence that had carried him through the evening. There has to be another way. Whitmore Global, my father built that company. Employees, thousands of them, depend on— You should have thought about employees before you falsified quarterly earnings to protect your bonus structure, Victoria said, her voice hardening. You should have thought about consequences before you used company funds to finance Madison's apartment, her wardrobe, her entire lifestyle, while telling your board those expenses were marketing investments. Alexander's face went pale. How could you possibly know about— Because I still have friends inside Whitmore Global, Alexander, Victoria said quietly. People who remember exactly how hard I worked to build that company's foundation. People who were disgusted watching you dismantle everything I helped create, piece by piece, to fund a relationship built entirely on appearances. The weight of her words crushed the last remaining fragments of Alexander's composure. He sank slightly, bracing one hand against the edge of a nearby table, his mind spiraling through consequences he hadn't even begun to calculate. The board, he said weakly, If investigators open an inquiry, the board will demand my resignation before the week is out." "Probably," Victoria agreed, without a trace of satisfaction in her voice. "The Halstead merger will likely collapse," Victoria finished for him. "Yes, everything I built, everything you built on a foundation of fraud and borrowed brilliance," Victoria said, "was always going to collapse eventually, Alexander. I simply decided I was done protecting you from that reality." Silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant clatter of cleanup crews dismantling the elegant world that had, only hours earlier, celebrated Alexander Whitmore as untouchable. "Why now?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. "You've had 3 years. Why wait until tonight?" Victoria's expression softened, just slightly, into something almost sad. "Because I needed to build something first," she said. "I needed to become someone who couldn't be dismissed, threatened, or bought into silence. I needed the world to see exactly who I was before I let them see exactly who you are." She paused, studying him one final time, searching his face for something Alexander couldn't quite identify. "I needed to matter first," she said quietly, "on my own terms, not as your wife, not as your victim, not as a footnote in your success story." Alexander had no response. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. The desperate scrambling of a man who had spent 3 years believing himself untouchable, only to discover, in a single devastating evening, that the woman he discarded had been quietly building the exact tools required to dismantle everything he valued. "I have to go," Victoria said finally, gathering her tablet, her composure fully restored, the brief crack in her armor sealing shut as smoothly as it had opened. "I have an early meeting with federal investigators tomorrow." "Victoria?" "Good night, Alexander," she said, already turning away. "I hope eventually you find whatever version of peace you're capable of." She walked away without looking back, her midnight blue gown disappearing through the ballroom doors, leaving Alexander standing alone amid overturned chairs and half-cleared tables, the ruins of an evening that had begun with him believing he had everything and was ending with the sickening realization that he had nothing left to stand on at all. He didn't remember calling for his car. He didn't remember the drive home. He barely registered walking through his own front door, where Madison waited in the dim living room light, arms crossed, expression tight with impatience, and something colder underneath. "Well?" she demanded. "What did she want? What was so important you left me standing alone at a party?" Alexander sank onto the edge of the couch, his head in his hands, the full weight of the evening finally crashing over him completely. "Federal investigators," he said quietly. "She reported everything, the Meridian accounts, the Halstead irregularities, your apartment expenses filed as marketing costs." Madison's face went white. "She knows about that?" "She's known for years," Alexander said, his voice hollow. "She's known everything for years." "Then fix it," Madison snapped, panic sharpening her voice. "Call your lawyers, call the board, do something, Alexander. You always fix things." He looked up at her slowly, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. "I don't think this is something I can fix," he said quietly. Madison stared at him, and for one long, unbearable moment, Alexander watched something shift behind her eyes. The same calculation he had witnessed at the gala, the same careful weighing of advantage and risk that had defined every interaction between them since the beginning. "I need to think," she said finally, stepping back from him. "I need to figure out what this means for us." She disappeared toward the bedroom without waiting for a response, leaving Alexander alone in the dim living room, surrounded by the trophies of a success he suddenly understood had never truly belonged to him at all. Somewhere across the city, in an office lit only by the glow of a laptop screen, Victoria Sterling sat quietly reviewing final documentation, preparing for a meeting that would set in motion consequences Alexander Whitmore had spent 3 years believing he'd escaped entirely. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a quiet, steady resolve that had carried her through 3 years of rebuilding herself from nothing into someone the world could no longer afford to ignore. Tomorrow, the investigation would begin, And by the end of the week, Alexander Whitmore would learn exactly how much devastation could grow from a single mistake he'd made 3 years ago. The mistake of believing that a quiet woman with nothing left to lose was a woman with nothing left to give. He was about to learn precisely how wrong he had been. Morning came too fast for Alexander, sunlight cutting through the blinds like an accusation he wasn't ready to face. His phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. Missed calls piled up on the screen. His lawyer, his chief financial officer, 2 board members, and a name he didn't recognize with a New York area code that made his stomach twist the moment he saw it. He sat up in bed alone. Madison's side was empty, the sheets cold, her closet door left open just enough to reveal 3 empty hangers where her favorite dresses used to hang. Madison? No answer. He walked through this penthouse calling her name, his voice echoing off marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that had once made him feel like a king surveying his kingdom. Now, they just made him feel exposed. Her toothbrush was gone from the bathroom, her perfume bottles gone from the vanity. A single note sat on the kitchen counter, written in Madison's looping handwriting. "I can't be associated with this. I'm sorry. You'll understand." Alexander stared at the note for a long time, waiting to feel something: betrayal, heartbreak, anger. Instead, he felt almost nothing at all, just a hollow, exhausted recognition that he had seen this exact moment coming the night before and hadn't let himself believe it. His phone rang again. This time he answered. Alexander. His lawyer's voice was tight, clipped, professional in the way lawyers get when they're delivering news they know will land badly. "We need to talk, now, in person." What happened? Federal investigators executed a subpoena for Whitmore Global's financial records at 7 this morning, his lawyer said. They're requesting 5 years of transaction history, including the Meridian shell accounts. Alexander's knees nearly gave out. He gripped the kitchen counter for support. How did they know about Meridian? He asked, though he already knew the answer, had known it since the moment Victoria's voice cut through that ballroom the night before. "That's exactly what I want to discuss," his lawyer said. "In person, my office, 1 hour." The line went dead before Alexander could respond. He stood alone in his kitchen, phone still pressed against his ear, the silence of the empty penthouse pressing down on him like a physical weight. 24 hours ago, he had walked into the Liberty Crown Gala believing he owned the world. Now the world was quietly, methodically dismantling him. The drive to his lawyer's office felt endless. Manhattan traffic crawling past windows Alexander barely registered, his mind replaying every word Victoria had spoken the night before on an endless, torturous loop. "I kept everything. I needed to matter first. I'm done explaining you to anyone." By the time he reached the law offices of Grayson and Pierce, his hands had started shaking, a tremor he hadn't experienced since the earliest, most desperate days of building Whitmore Global from nothing. His lawyer, Daniel Grayson, met him in the lobby, expression grim, gesturing him toward a private conference room without the usual pleasantries. "Sit," Daniel said, closing the door firmly behind them. Alexander sat. "I'm going to ask you something," Daniel said, sliding into the chair across from him. "And I need you to answer honestly, because everything that happens next depends on it. Did you falsify quarterly earnings reports to protect executive bonus structures in the last fiscal year?" Alexander's silence answered before his words did. "Alexander." "It wasn't falsification," Alexander said weakly. "It was aggressive accounting. Every company does it." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, rubbing his temple like a man already exhausted by a battle he hadn't even started fighting yet. "And the Meridian shell accounts? The ones from 5 years ago?" "That deal never closed," Alexander said. "Those accounts are dormant." "They're not dormant," Daniel said. "They're active. Someone's been monitoring them for years, tracking every transfer, every deposit, every dollar that moved through them during the Halstead negotiations." Alexander's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. Those accounts were sealed. Nobody had access except—" He stopped mid-sentence, the realization crashing over him with sickening finality. Except Victoria. She had reviewed those accounts herself, years ago, back when he still trusted her judgment more than his own legal team's. She had warned him. She had begged him to close those accounts before they became a liability. He had told her to mind her own business. She's had access this entire time, Alexander said quietly, mostly to himself. Who? Daniel asked sharply. My ex-wife, Alexander said. Victoria Sterling. Daniel's expression shifted, something between disbelief and dawning horror crossing his face. The Phoenix Foundation woman? The one hosting the gala last night? You knew about that? Alexander, everyone in this city knew about that gala, Daniel said. What I didn't know until 40 minutes ago when the subpoena landed on my desk was that the whistleblower who triggered this entire investigation filed her initial complaint 18 months ago. Alexander felt the floor tilt beneath him. 18 months? She's been building this case for a year and a half, Daniel said, gathering documentation, corroborating financial records, building relationships with federal investigators who needed exactly the kind of detailed, insider knowledge she clearly possessed. Why wait? Alexander asked, though some exhausted, defeated part of him already understood the answer, had understood it the moment Victoria explained it to him the night before. Why not report it the second she found it? Does it matter why? Daniel asked, his voice sharpening with barely restrained frustration. What matters right now is that we have federal investigators combing through 5 years of records that, from what you're telling me, will not hold up to scrutiny. Alexander put his head in his hands. What do we do? Right now, Daniel said, we prepare for the very real possibility that you will be asked to step down as CEO before the weekends. The board meets in 3 hours to discuss the subpoena. I strongly recommend you don't fight this publicly. Cooperation is your only path to minimizing criminal exposure. Criminal exposure, Alexander repeated hollowly. You're talking about prison. Daniel didn't answer immediately, and his silence was worse than any words could have been. Alexander, he said finally, carefully, I need you to understand something. Whatever documentation your ex-wife has compiled, it's detailed enough that federal investigators secured a subpoena within 12 hours of receiving it. That doesn't happen with weak evidence. That happens when someone hands prosecutors an airtight case. The 3 hours between that meeting and the emergency board session passed in a blur Alexander could barely piece together afterward. He remembered sitting in his car outside Whitmore Global's headquarters, unable to make himself walk through the doors he had walked through triumphantly 10,000 times before. He remembered his phone buzzing constantly with messages from reporters who had somehow already caught wind of the investigation, business partners suddenly unavailable, contacts who had spent years courting his favor now conveniently unreachable. He remembered most painfully scrolling through old photos on his phone without meaning to, photos from years earlier, before Madison, before the gala, before any of this. Photos of Victoria laughing at some forgettable dinner party, unaware of the camera, unaware that the man taking the picture would one day discard her like she'd never mattered at all. He deleted the photos quickly, as though erasing them could erase the growing, suffocating guilt tightening around his chest. The boardroom, when he finally forced himself inside, felt different than it ever had before. The long mahogany table that had witnessed 100 triumphant announcements now felt like a courtroom. 12 board members seated with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. Alexander, said this board chairman, an older man named Frank Hutchins, who had known Alexander's father decades earlier. We've reviewed the subpoena documentation. We need answers, and we need them now. Alexander stood at the head of the table, feeling smaller than he had in years. The confidence that had carried him through countless boardroom battles completely evaporated. I understand your concerns, he began. Concerns? Interrupted a younger board member, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who had joined the board 2 years earlier specifically to modernize the company's oversight practices. Alexander, federal investigators are examining evidence of falsified earnings reports and improperly diverted funds. This isn't a concern. This is an existential threat to this company's survival. The evidence is circumstantial, Alexander said, though even as the words left his mouth, he heard how weak they sounded. Is it? Patricia asked, sliding a folder across the table toward him. Because the documentation I received this morning includes account numbers, transfer dates, and dollar amounts that match Whitmore Global's internal records almost perfectly. Someone with intimate knowledge of this company's financial systems compiled this, someone who knew exactly where to look. Alexander opened the folder with trembling hands, and his stomach dropped completely at what he found inside. Bank statements, wire transfer records, internal memos he had specifically instructed his assistant to shred years ago, copies of contracts he had personally altered before signing. Victoria hadn't just remembered the irregularities. She had documented every single one of them with meticulous, devastating precision. "Where did you get this?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "It was included in the whistleblower complaint that triggered the subpoena," Frank said grimly. "Alexander, I've known your family for 30 years. I watched your father build this company from a single warehouse in Queens. I need you to look me in the eye right now and tell me whether these documents are accurate." Alexander stared at the folder, at years of careful deception laid bare in cold, undeniable numbers, and understood that there was no version of this conversation that ended with him keeping his company. "Some of them," he admitted quietly, "are accurate." The room went completely silent. "Which ones?" Frank asked, his voice heavy with disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could have. "The Meridian accounts," Alexander said. "The earnings adjustments, some of the Halstead negotiation expenses." He paused, forcing himself to finish. Most of it is accurate." Patricia closed her eyes briefly, shaking her head slowly. "Alexander, do you have any idea what you've done? Not just to this company, to every employee whose retirement is tied to our stock performance, to every investor who trusted your name on a contract." "I know," Alexander said, though the words felt inadequate, hollow, pathetically insufficient against the magnitude of what he'd actually done. "The board will need to vote," Frank said finally, his voice tired, decades of respect for Alexander's family visibly crumbling under the weight of what he'd just learned. "Given the severity of these allegations, I don't see how we avoid an immediate leadership change." "You're firing me," Alexander said. It wasn't a question. "We're protecting this company," Frank corrected quietly. "Whatever comes next for you personally, Alexander, is now a matter for federal prosecutors, not this board." The vote took 11 minutes. It was unanimous. Alexander Whitmore, who 3 years earlier had stood in this very boardroom announcing record profits to a standing ovation, walked out of Whitmore Global's headquarters that afternoon, no longer CEO, his executive access already revoked. Security escorting him to his car with the same polite, distant efficiency they might show any stranger being removed from private property. He sat in his car outside the building he had considered his second home for over a decade, watching employees move in and out of the revolving doors, none of them aware yet that the man watching them from behind tinted windows had just lost everything he'd spent his entire adult life building. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Turn on the news." Alexander's hands shook as he opened his streaming app, searching for any local news coverage, his stomach twisting into knots before he even found the segment. There it was. Breaking news banner, red and urgent, scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Whitmore Global CEO steps down amid federal financial investigation. The anchor's voice, calm and professional, delivered the details with clinical precision that felt like knives against Alexander's already raw nerves. Sources confirm Alexander Whitmore has resigned as CEO following a federal subpoena examining alleged financial irregularities dating back 5 years. The investigation reportedly began with a whistleblower complaint filed 18 months ago by an individual with direct knowledge of the company's internal financial practices. The screen cut briefly to file footage. Alexander at some old press conference, smiling confidently, completely unaware of the storm quietly gathering around him even then. Whitmore Global's stock has fallen nearly 30% in early trading following the announcement, the anchor continued, with analysts warning further declines are likely as investigators continue reviewing 5 years of financial records. Alexander turned off the phone screen, unable to watch anymore, his own downfall broadcast in real time to millions of strangers who would forget his name within a week and remember only the scandal attached to it. His phone rang again almost immediately. This time, the caller ID read a name he hadn't expected. Robert, the silver-haired investor from the Gala. Alexander hesitated, then answered. "Robert." "Alexander?" Robert's voice carried none of its earlier warmth. I'm calling to inform you, as a courtesy, that I've instructed my firm to liquidate our entire position in Whitmore Global effective immediately. Robert, please, if you'll just let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Robert interrupted sharply. I sat across from Victoria Sterling for 20 minutes last night, listening to her describe the exact kind of financial integrity she expects from the organizations she funds. I should have realized then that her standards existed because she'd watched someone violate them personally. The line went dead. Alexander sat alone in his car, phone slipping from numb fingers into his lap, watching the last remnants of his carefully constructed empire dissolve in real time across news feeds and investor calls he had no power to stop. His phone buzzed again. Another call. Another investor, another partner, another voice informing him, with varying degrees of politeness, that their business relationship had officially ended. By early evening, Alexander had lost count of how many calls he'd received. He sat in his empty penthouse, television playing quietly in the background, cycling through the same devastating headline on every channel he flipped to. His phone buzzed one final time, a text from Madison. I saw the news. I'm sorry it had to be this way. I hope you understand. I have to protect myself. Attached to the message was a screenshot, a photo of Madison at a different event entirely, smiling brightly beside a different wealthy man Alexander vaguely recognized from some tech conference months earlier, the caption already circulating on social media describing her as his rumored new companion. Less than 12 hours after leaving Alexander's penthouse, Madison had already found her next opportunity. Alexander stared at the screenshot for a long time, feeling something he hadn't expected to feel. Not heartbreak, not jealousy, but a strange, exhausted clarity. Madison had never loved him. She had loved his money, his power, his name attached to magazine covers. The moment those things disappeared, so did she, as effortlessly and completely as smoke dissolving into still air. He thought about Victoria, really thought about her, for the first time in years, without the defensive anger he'd carried since their divorce. Victoria had never once asked him for money during their marriage, never once demanded jewelry, luxury vacations, or public displays of wealth. She had asked him only to be honest, to be careful, to build something that could withstand scrutiny. He had called that boring. He had called that ordinary. He had thrown it away for someone who couldn't even stay loyal through a single news cycle. His phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed his lawyer's name. Daniel, Alexander answered, exhausted. We need to discuss your legal strategy, Daniel said without preamble. Federal prosecutors have indicated they're prepared to file formal charges within the next 2 weeks unless we can negotiate a cooperation agreement. What kind of cooperation agreement? Full financial disclosure, complete cooperation with their investigation into Whitmore Global's practices, possible restitution to affected shareholders. Daniel paused. And Alexander, I need to be honest with you, even with full cooperation, you're likely looking at significant financial penalties, possibly criminal charges depending on how prosecutors decide to proceed. Prison, Alexander said quietly. It's possible, Daniel admitted. I won't lie to you about that. Alexander closed his eyes, leaning back against his couch, the weight of everything crashing over him at once. The company, the reputation, the relationship he'd sacrificed everything to maintain, all of it collapsing within a single devastating day. Is there anything I can do? He asked. Anything at all? Cooperate fully, Daniel said. Beyond that, Alexander, I think you need to start preparing yourself for a very different life than the one you're used to. The call ended, leaving Alexander alone once more in the silence of his penthouse, surrounded by expensive furniture and framed magazine covers, celebrating achievements that suddenly felt like relics from a stranger's life. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the dim evening light, and sat by the window overlooking a city that had, 24 hours earlier, celebrated him as one of its most powerful men. Now that same city was quietly, efficiently erasing him. His phone buzzed one final time that evening. Not a call, a news alert. Phoenix Foundation announces major new initiative, financial literacy program for displaced spouses. Alexander opened the article despite himself, scanning quickly through Victoria's official statement, quoted near the bottom of the piece. Too many people, particularly women, find themselves financially vulnerable after relationships end, often because they were deliberately kept uninformed about family finances by partners who valued control over honesty. This program exists to ensure no one else has to rebuild their entire life from nothing, the way I once did. Alexander set the phone down slowly, staring out at the city lights beyond his window, understanding with painful, complete clarity that Victoria wasn't simply destroying him. She was building something meaningful from the wreckage he'd created, transforming her own devastation into purpose, her own abandonment into a mission that would outlast every headline currently tearing his reputation apart. He had spent 3 years believing he'd won something the night he handed her that suitcase. He understood now, sitting alone in an empty penthouse surrounded by the ruins of everything he'd built, that he had lost the only person who had ever truly believed in who he could become. And in losing her, he had ultimately guaranteed his own downfall, one carefully documented irregularity at a time. The investigation was only beginning, and somewhere across the city, Victoria Sterling was only just getting started. 2 weeks passed, and Alexander Whitmore learned exactly how quickly a man's world could shrink once the money and the title disappeared. He sold the penthouse first, not because he wanted to, but because his lawyer insisted the liquid cash would be necessary for what was coming. He moved into a modest, rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place he hadn't lived in since his early 20s, back when Victoria used to bring him coffee at his tiny desk and tell him with unshakable conviction that he was going to build something extraordinary. He hadn't thought about those memories in years. Now they surfaced constantly, unwelcome and relentless, every quiet evening alone in his sparse new apartment, forcing him to confront exactly how much he had thrown away, chasing an image he thought mattered more than substance. His phone rang. Daniel again. "Alexander, we need to discuss the settlement terms federal prosecutors are proposing." "Tell me," Alexander said, sitting down heavily on the second-hand couch that had come with the apartment. "They're offering a deal," Daniel said. "Full restitution to affected shareholders, a substantial fine, and probation instead of prison time. But only if you cooperate completely and provide testimony regarding the full scope of the fraud, including any other executives who may have been involved." Alexander closed his eyes. "There's no one else. I made these decisions alone." "Are you certain?" Daniel asked carefully. "Because prosecutors seem to believe otherwise. They've been asking pointed questions about your former CFO." Alexander's stomach turned. His former chief financial officer, a quiet, loyal man named Gerald Simmons, who had followed every instruction Alexander gave him without question for nearly a decade, had processed most of the fraudulent transfers on Alexander's direct orders. "Gerald was following my instructions," Alexander said quietly. "He didn't design any of this. I did." "That's admirable," Daniel said, "but it may not matter much to prosecutors building a case. Cooperation typically means naming everyone involved, Alexander, not just accepting blame yourself." "I won't do that to Gerald," Alexander said firmly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. "He has 3 kids, a mortgage. He trusted me because I was his boss, and I used that trust to make him complicit in something he never would have chosen on his own." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant risk to take, Alexander. Full cooperation is the only path to the reduced sentence currently on the table." "Then I'll take whatever comes," Alexander said, and for the first time since the gala, he felt something unexpected stirring beneath the exhaustion and shame, something that felt almost like the beginning of dignity, however small, however late. The call ended, and Alexander sat alone in his quiet apartment, staring at the sparse walls, wondering when exactly he had become a man capable of throwing away his own wife's trust while simultaneously discovering, at the very end of everything, some fragile version of integrity he apparently still possessed. His phone buzzed with the different notification, a news alert, one of dozens he'd received over the past 2 weeks, most of them detailing further collapse of Whitmore Global's stock price, further defections among former business partners, further public dissection of his fall from grace. This one was different. Phoenix Foundation Gala raises record-breaking $500 million for displaced families nationwide. Alexander opened the article despite the familiar ache it caused, scrolling through photos of Victoria at various events over the following days, accepting an award from the mayor, touring a newly renovated shelter for displaced families, sitting on a panel discussing financial literacy alongside senators and business leaders who had, until recently, courted Alexander's approval with the same enthusiasm they now reserved for her. She looked happy in every photo, genuinely happy, in a way Alexander couldn't remember ever truly seeing during their marriage, when her smiles had always carried a certain careful restraint, a quiet awareness that his moods dictated the emotional temperature of their household. He scrolled further and found a video interview, Victoria seated across from a well-known journalist, discussing the foundation's rapid growth. "What made you decide to build something so significant after your divorce?" the journalist asked. Victoria considered the question for a moment before answering. "I spent years being told my value depended entirely on someone else's approval," she said calmly. "When that approval disappeared, I had a choice. I could accept the story I was told about myself, that I was ordinary, replaceable, not enough, or I could prove, to myself first and everyone else second, that my worth was never actually up for someone else's evaluation." "Do you ever think about your ex-husband?" the journalist asked, her tone gentle but pointed. Victoria's expression remained composed, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes. "I think about the lesson he taught me," she said, "which is that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the exact catalyst you needed to become who you were always meant to be." Alexander closed the video, unable to watch further, the quiet dignity in her voice cutting far deeper than any anger could have. He spent that evening, as he had spent many evenings since the scandal broke, thinking about everything he could have done differently, not just with Victoria, though certainly with her most of all, but with the entire trajectory of his life. The decisions he'd made, believing wealth and status were the ultimate measures of success. The relationships he'd sacrificed, chasing an image that ultimately proved as hollow as it looked from the outside. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. An unfamiliar number. "Alexander Whitmore?" a woman's voice asked. "Speaking." "My name is Sarah Kim. I'm a producer with the Financial Times. We're working on a feature story about the collapse of Whitmore Global, and we'd like to offer you the opportunity to share your perspective directly, rather than letting the narrative continue to be shaped entirely by outside sources." Alexander hesitated. Every instinct honed over years of careful public relations management told him to decline, to protect whatever fragments of reputation remained, to let his lawyers handle any public statements. But something else, some new and unfamiliar impulse, made him pause. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked. "Honesty," Sarah said simply. "The public has heard plenty about what you did wrong. They haven't heard anything from you directly about why or what you've learned, or what accountability actually looks like for someone in your position." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Give me a few days to think about it." "Of course," Sarah said. "But Alexander, if I may say something off the record?" "Go ahead." "I've covered a lot of corporate scandals," she said. "Most executives in your position spend months, sometimes years, deflecting blame, hiring crisis management teams, doing everything possible to avoid genuine accountability. The fact that you're even considering speaking directly, without a scripted PR statement, suggests something different might be happening here." The call ended, leaving Alexander staring at his phone, considering an option he wouldn't have taken seriously even a month earlier. 3 days later, he sat across from Sarah Kim in a quiet corner of a nondescript coffee shop. No cameras, no publicist hovering nearby, just a recorder placed carefully on the table between them. "Let's start simple," Sarah said. "Why did you do it? The falsified earnings, the shell accounts. You were already extraordinarily wealthy. What made the risk worth taking?" Alexander considered the question longer than he expected to. "I think," he said slowly, "I convinced myself that success required constant, aggressive growth, that standing still, even briefly, meant falling behind. I stopped asking whether decisions were right and started only asking whether they were profitable." "Your ex-wife reviewed many of these documents years before the fraud was discovered," Sarah said. "Reports suggest she warned you repeatedly. Why didn't you listen?" Alexander felt his chest tighten. Because I believed listening to her made me weak, he admitted. I believed a man in my position needed to make decisions independently without needing anyone else's validation, especially not— He paused, correcting himself. Especially not my wife's. That sounds like more than just business philosophy, Sarah observed carefully. It was ego, Alexander said, the admission costing him something significant to voice aloud. Victoria was brilliant, sharper than most of the executives I hired, sharper than most of the lawyers I paid enormous salaries to advise me. But somewhere along the way, I decided her intelligence threatened my own image rather than complementing it. So you replaced her, Sarah said, her tone neutral but pointed. With someone who wouldn't challenge you. Alexander nodded slowly. Someone who made me feel powerful instead of accountable. I told myself it was about compatibility, about building an image that matched the success I'd achieved. But honestly, looking back, I think I just wanted someone who would never make me feel the way Victoria did when she was right and I was wrong. How does it feel, Sarah asked, watching her build something extraordinary while your own empire collapses? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee, choosing his words with unusual care. It feels like justice, he finally said. Not the kind I would have chosen for myself, but the kind I probably deserve. Victoria built the Phoenix Foundation using nothing but her own intelligence and resilience, the same qualities I dismissed as unimportant when I threw her away. Meanwhile, everything I built collapsed the moment its foundation of lies was finally exposed. Do you regret what happened between you two? Sarah asked. Every single day, Alexander said, his voice cracking slightly, genuine emotion breaking through the careful composure he'd maintained throughout the interview. Not just because of what it cost me professionally, because I had something rare, a partner who actually saw the flaws in my plans before they became catastrophes, who cared enough to tell me uncomfortable truths instead of flattering lies, and I threw it away because I mistook her honesty for weakness. The interview continued for another hour, Alexander answering questions with a candor that surprised even himself, stripped of the defensive posturing that had defined nearly every public statement he'd made throughout his career. When the article published 3 days later, it generated more attention than Alexander expected, not because it excused his actions, but because it offered something rare in corporate scandal coverage, an executive taking full, unflinching accountability without attempting to minimize or deflect the consequences of his choices. Public reaction remained largely critical, as Alexander expected. But something else emerged in the days following publication that he hadn't anticipated at all. Gerald Simmons, his former CFO, called him directly for the first time since the scandal broke. I read the article, Gerald said quietly. Gerald, I'm sorry, Alexander said immediately, for everything. For putting you in a position where following my instructions made you complicit in something you never would have chosen. I know, Gerald said. I've known you were sorry since I heard you refused to name me during your cooperation agreement, even though it would have significantly reduced your own sentence. Alexander hadn't realized that detail had become public knowledge. You didn't have to protect me, Gerald continued. Prosecutors already had enough evidence to charge me regardless of what you said or didn't say. I know, Alexander admitted, but you deserve the chance to defend yourself honestly without me making things worse by shifting blame onto you. Gerald was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, he said finally, I don't think the man on the phone right now is the same man I worked for these past 10 years. The words landed with unexpected weight, and Alexander found himself unable to respond immediately, throat tight with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. I hope you're right, he finally managed. That evening, sitting alone in his sparse apartment, Alexander received an email notification he hadn't expected. A message from Victoria's Foundation, addressed not to him personally, but to a general press inquiry account he'd apparently been added to after the Financial Times article circulated widely enough to catch the Foundation's attention. The email contained a public statement released that afternoon addressing the widespread media coverage surrounding Alexander's case. The Phoenix Foundation exists to help people rebuild their lives after devastating circumstances, regardless of how those circumstances came to be. While we cannot speak to matters currently under federal investigation, we believe genuine accountability, the kind demonstrated through honest reflection rather than deflection, represents an important step in anyone's journey toward meaningful change. Alexander read the statement 3 times, searching for hidden meaning, for confirmation that Victoria herself had approved these particular words, chosen this particular language. He would never know for certain, but something in the careful, measured tone felt unmistakably like her voice, like the same quiet wisdom that had once guided him through countless business decisions he'd been too arrogant to credit her for. 2 months later, Alexander stood in a federal courtroom, formally sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility, along with substantial financial penalties that would take years, possibly decades, to fully repay. The judge, reviewing his full cooperation and his refusal to implicate subordinates who had merely followed his instructions, noted in her ruling that his conduct following the initial fraud, while insufficient to erase the original harm, demonstrated a rare willingness toward genuine accountability that the court found noteworthy. It wasn't redemption. Alexander understood that clearly. Redemption would require years of consistent action, not a single interview or a single sentencing hearing. But it was perhaps a beginning, the first honest step in a much longer journey toward becoming someone worthy of whatever second chances life might eventually offer him. As bailiffs led him from the courtroom, Alexander glanced briefly toward the gallery, half expecting, half hoping to see a familiar face among the scattered reporters and curious spectators. Victoria wasn't there. He hadn't truly expected her to be. Whatever she had done, she hadn't done it out of anger or personal vendetta. She had done it out of necessity, out of the simple, unavoidable truth that fraud discovered couldn't remain buried forever, regardless of any lingering feelings toward the person who committed it. But as he was led toward the transport vehicle waiting outside, his lawyer handed him a small, sealed envelope. "This arrived at my office yesterday," Daniel said quietly. "Addressed to you. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you before sentencing or after, but given everything today, I thought now made sense." Alexander opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding inside a single handwritten note, Victoria's familiar, precise handwriting instantly recognizable even after 3 years apart. "I never wanted your downfall to feel like victory. I hope eventually you build something real from whatever remains. Not for me, for yourself. V." Alexander read the note 3 times, tears he hadn't allowed himself since the scandal began finally slipping free, unstoppable and long overdue. He folded the note carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket, and allowed himself to be led toward whatever came next. Not the powerful, untouchable man who had once walked confidently into the Liberty Crown Gala, believing he'd conquered everything worth conquering, but someone new, someone humbled, someone finally beginning to understand that the truest measure of worth had never been wealth, status, or public admiration at all. It had always been integrity, and he had thrown that away long before Victoria ever exposed a single fraudulent account. 18 months is a long time to sit with yourself, and Alexander Whitmore spent every single day of it doing exactly that. The facility wasn't the nightmare his imagination had conjured in the weeks leading up to sentencing, but it wasn't forgiving either. It stripped away every remaining illusion he had about who he was, every last excuse he'd been quietly rehearsing about circumstances beyond his control. There was nowhere left to perform, nobody left to impress, just Alexander, alone with the truth of every decision that had brought him there. He worked in the facility's small library during his first 6 months, cataloging donated books, and it was there, surrounded by other people's stories, that he started writing his own. Not for publication, not for redemption, just to understand, finally, how a man who had everything convinced himself that none of it mattered, unless the whole world was watching him have it. "You've got a visitor," a guard told him one afternoon, 4 months into his sentence. Alexander's heart lifted with a hope he immediately tried to suppress. It wasn't Victoria. He knew that before he even reached the visitation room. Victoria hadn't written, hadn't called, hadn't reached out since that single note handed to him outside the courtroom. He didn't blame her. He didn't expect anything more. It was Gerald. His former CFO sat across the table, looking older than Alexander remembered, but steady in a way that suggested he'd found his own version of peace. "I got a new job," Gerald said without preamble. "Regional accounting firm. Smaller, honest work." "I'm glad," Alexander said, and meant it completely. "I'm not here for pleasantries," Gerald continued. "I'm here because I read your letters. The ones you sent the board, the shareholders, apologizing directly instead of through lawyers. My wife read them too. She said something I think you should hear." "What's that?" "She said it's rare for a man to fall that far and land looking up instead of looking for someone else to blame." Alexander sat with that for a long moment, something in his chest loosening slightly, some fragment of the shame he'd carried for months easing, just barely, under the weight of an unexpected kindness he hadn't earned but had apparently somehow still received. Time moved differently after that visit, slower in some ways, faster in others. Alexander began corresponding with a financial literacy nonprofit inside the facility, teaching basic accounting principles to other inmates preparing for release, men who had never been taught the difference between a checking account and a con. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't covered by any news outlet. But for the first time in years, Alexander felt something he hadn't felt while running an empire worth billions. He felt useful in a way that didn't depend on anyone watching. News from the outside world reached him in fragments. Letters from Daniel, occasional articles clipped from newspapers by fellow inmates who recognized his name and, surprisingly, didn't hold it against him the way he expected. Whitmore Global had been sold in pieces, its assets absorbed by competitors, its name slowly disappearing from the business landscape it once dominated. Alexander felt no grief watching it go. Whatever that company had become under his leadership deserved to disappear. What his father had built deserved better than what Alexander had turned it into. Victoria's foundation, meanwhile, continued its steady, remarkable growth. Daniel mentioned it occasionally in his letters, almost apologetically, as though unsure whether Alexander wanted to hear updates about the woman who had, indirectly, ended his career and sent him to prison. Alexander always wanted to hear. The Phoenix Foundation opened its third regional office. Victoria testified before Congress about financial transparency legislation. She received an honorary degree from a university that, coincidentally, Alexander had once donated an enormous sum to in exchange for a building named after his father. He read every clipping twice, searching each one for some hint of how she was truly doing beneath the polished public persona, some sign that the woman he'd once shared a life with still existed beneath the confident, composed queen of the Phoenix Foundation the world now knew. He never found what he was looking for in newsprint. But 18 months gave him plenty of time to stop searching for answers outside himself and start building them from within. The day of his release arrived quieter than he expected. No cameras waited outside the facility gates. No reporters shouted questions as he walked through them, carrying a single duffel bag containing everything he owned in the world. Daniel picked him up in a modest sedan, nothing like the luxury vehicles that once ferried Alexander through Manhattan traffic. "Where to?" Daniel asked. "Somewhere small," Alexander said. "Somewhere I can start over without anyone expecting me to be someone I'm not anymore." Daniel drove him to a small apartment in Queens, not far from the original warehouse where Alexander's father had built Whitmore Global from nothing decades earlier. It felt fitting somehow, returning to where it all began, stripped of everything except the willingness to build something honest this time. Finding work proved harder than Alexander anticipated. His name carried weight, but not the kind that opened doors anymore. Most companies wanted nothing to do with a convicted felon, regardless of his cooperation, regardless of the genuine remorse documented extensively in his sentencing hearing. He finally found a position at a small accounting firm 3 subway stops from his apartment. Entry-level work far beneath anything he'd done in over a decade, reviewing basic tax documents for small business owners who couldn't afford larger firms. He loved it more than he expected to. There was something deeply satisfying about honest work, about helping a small restaurant owner understand her quarterly taxes, about guiding a young entrepreneur through his first business loan application without a single hidden clause or predatory term buried in the fine print. Alexander found himself remembering, with painful clarity, the version of himself who had once cared about building things correctly rather than building them quickly. 6 months into his new life, he received a letter that stopped him completely. The Phoenix Foundation letterhead was unmistakable, elegant and understated, nothing like the flashy branding Alexander might have chosen in his previous life. Inside was a formal invitation to a financial literacy symposium, one of many the foundation hosted regularly. This one specifically focused on helping formerly incarcerated individuals rebuild their financial lives after release. Alexander's name appeared on the guest list not as a disgraced executive, but as a keynote speaker. He called the number listed on the invitation immediately, confused, certain some administrative error had occurred. Phoenix Foundation, this is Rachel. Hi, I received an invitation, Alexander said carefully. I think there's been a mistake. I'm listed as a speaker. Let me check, Rachel said, and Alexander heard typing on the other end. Alexander Whitmore? Yes. No mistake, Rachel said. Ms. Sterling specifically requested you for this event. She said your journey from executive misconduct to financial literacy advocacy would provide meaningful perspective for our audience. Alexander sat down slowly, phone pressed against his ear, heart pounding in a way he hadn't experienced since the night the champagne glass shattered against that ballroom floor. She requested me specifically? That's what I have here, Rachel confirmed. Should I confirm your attendance? Alexander hesitated only a moment. Yes, he said, please confirm. The symposium took place 3 weeks later, in a modest conference center rather than the extravagant ballrooms Alexander remembered from his previous life. He arrived early, nervous in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar, having spoken to boardrooms and shareholders and reporters 1,000 times without ever feeling the particular anxiety currently tightening his chest. He saw her before she saw him. Victoria stood near the front of the room, reviewing notes with a colleague, wearing a simple navy dress instead of the midnight blue gown he remembered from the gala. She looked somehow both exactly the same and completely different. The same quiet confidence, but softer now, less armored, as though 3 years of building something meaningful had finally allowed her to exhale fully for the first time since their divorce. Alexander. Her voice, when she finally noticed him, carried no hostility, no lingering bitterness, just calm, measured recognition. Victoria, he said, thank you for the invitation. I wasn't sure. He paused, unsure how to finish the sentence honestly. I wasn't sure you'd want anything to do with me. This isn't about what I want, Victoria said. It's about what might help the people in this room. Your story, told honestly, could matter to someone trying to rebuild their own life right now. Is that the only reason? Alexander asked quietly. Victoria considered the question for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. I read your letters, she admitted. The ones to the shareholders, the interview with the Financial Times. I saw the sentencing transcript where you refused to implicate Gerald even though it would have helped your case. You kept track of all that? I kept track of whether the man who hurt me was capable of genuine change, Victoria said simply. Not because I needed him to change for my sake, because I needed to know whether people actually could, or whether I'd simply wasted years of my life loving someone incapable of it. And what did you decide? Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I decided people can change, Victoria said. If they're willing to do the difficult, unglamorous work of actually becoming someone different, rather than just performing contrition for an audience. Alexander felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of shame and longing he'd carried since that night at the gala, finally beginning to ease. I'm not asking for anything from you, he said carefully. I know I don't deserve— I know, Victoria interrupted gently. That's exactly why I invited you today. The symposium began shortly after, and Alexander delivered the most honest speech of his entire life, standing before an audience of people who understood, far better than any Wall Street investor ever could, exactly how devastating it felt to lose everything and face the terrifying, uncertain work of rebuilding from nothing. I used to believe success meant never being wrong, Alexander told the room. I surrounded myself with people who told me what I wanted to hear instead of what I needed to hear. And when someone who actually cared enough to challenge me existed in my life, I discarded her because her honesty threatened the image I'd built. He paused, scanning the room, seeing genuine recognition in dozens of faces who understood exactly what he meant. I spent 18 months in prison with nothing but my own thoughts, he continued. And the hardest realization wasn't losing my company, or my reputation, or my wealth. It was understanding that I had access to genuine partnership, genuine honesty, genuine love, and I threw it all away, chasing something that turned out to be worthless the moment my bank account emptied. After the speech, attendees approached him individually, sharing their own stories, their own struggles rebuilding financial stability after devastating setbacks. Alexander listened to each one with a patience and genuine attention he'd never possessed during his years running Whitmore Global. Victoria found him near the end of the event, most attendees having already departed. "That was a good speech," she said. "Thank you for giving me the chance to give it," Alexander replied. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. 3 years and an entire lifetime of consequences settled quietly between them. "I'm not the same person who threw you away," Alexander said finally. "I know that doesn't undo what I did. I know it doesn't erase 3 years of you rebuilding your entire life from a suitcase and a cruel sentence I should never have spoken. But I need you to know that I understand now, completely, exactly what I lost that night." Victoria studied him for a long moment, something unreadable but not unkind in her expression. "I forgave you a long time ago, Alexander," she said quietly. "Not because you deserved it, because carrying that anger was costing me more than it was costing you. I needed to let it go to build the life I actually wanted." "Does that mean—" Alexander started. "It doesn't mean what you're hoping it means," Victoria said gently but firmly, before he could finish the question. "Forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation. I'm genuinely glad you're rebuilding your life with more honesty than you had before, but that doesn't mean I'm interested in rebuilding a life with you." Alexander nodded slowly, disappointment settling in his chest, but accompanied, surprisingly, by something like peace rather than devastation. "I understand," he said. "I think some part of me needed to hear that clearly, so I stopped wondering." "What will you do now?" Victoria asked. "Keep doing the work," Alexander said. "The accounting firm, the volunteer programs at the facility. Try to build something real this time, even if it's small, even if nobody's watching." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile she'd offered him since that devastating night at the gala. "That sounds like exactly the right place to start." She extended her hand, and Alexander shook it, understanding that this simple, professional gesture represented something far more significant than any handshake he'd ever exchanged in a boardroom. Closure, finally, after years of destruction, denial, and difficult reckoning. "Thank you, Victoria," he said, "for everything, even the parts that hurt." "Especially the parts that hurt," Victoria said. "Those were the parts that mattered most." She walked away, disappearing into the emptying conference hall, and Alexander watched her go without the desperate, grasping need he'd carried at the gala 18 months earlier. Just quiet gratitude for a woman who had taught him, through devastating consequence rather than gentle instruction, exactly what genuine worth actually required. Years later, Alexander still worked at the same small accounting firm, though he'd been promoted to senior advisor, specializing in helping formerly incarcerated individuals navigate the complicated financial landscape of rebuilding their lives after release. He never remarried, never sought the spotlight again, content instead with the quiet satisfaction of honest work and genuine relationships built without pretense or performance. He occasionally saw Victoria's name in headlines, the Phoenix Foundation continuing its remarkable growth, her influence expanding into policy reform that would protect countless future spouses from experiencing the same devastating financial vulnerability she once endured. He never reached out again. He understood, finally and completely, that some doors close not because of ongoing punishment, but because genuine growth sometimes requires walking forward without looking back toward what you can no longer have. The suitcase he'd once handed Victoria on a Manhattan sidewalk, believing himself powerful and untouchable, had ultimately become the exact catalyst that built the most extraordinary version of her, while everything he'd built to replace her crumbled the moment its foundation of lies was finally exposed to daylight. Alexander Whitmore learned, in the most devastating way imaginable, that true worth was never measured by wealth, status, or how many cameras flashed in your direction on a red carpet. It was measured by integrity, quiet, consistent, unglamorous integrity. The exact quality he had once dismissed as ordinary in the woman who turned out to be the most extraordinary person he would ever know. And in the end, that lesson, however painful, however costly, was the only inheritance truly worth passing forward. 5 years after that symposium, Alexander Whitmore stood outside a small elementary school in Queens, waiting his turn to speak at a career day event his niece had begged him to attend. It was the kind of invitation he never would have accepted in his old life, the kind of afternoon that once would have felt beneath a man who used to negotiate billion-dollar mergers before lunch. Now it felt like exactly where he belonged. "Uncle Alex, you're up next," his niece Emma whispered, tugging his sleeve with the particular urgency only an 8-year-old could summon. "Mrs. Patterson says accountants are boring, but I told her you're not boring." Alexander laughed, kneeling down to her eye level. "Well, we better prove Mrs. Patterson wrong then." He walked to the front of the classroom moments later, 30 small faces staring up at him with the kind of unguarded curiosity adults rarely offered anymore. He talked about numbers, about honesty, about the importance of always telling the truth, even when it felt uncomfortable. He didn't mention Whitmore Global. He didn't mention prison. Some stories, he'd learned, needed different audiences, different moments, different kinds of honesty suited to different kinds of listeners. Afterward, walking Emma back to her mother's car, his phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Saw something you should know about. Call me when you can." Alexander frowned, an old familiar unease tightening briefly in his chest before he reminded himself, as he'd trained himself to do over the past several years, that not every unexpected message carried devastating news. Sometimes a message was simply a message. He called Daniel that evening, once Emma had been safely delivered home, and Alexander had returned to the quiet studio apartment he'd occupied for the past 3 years, small but entirely his own, purchased outright with money he'd earned honestly, dollar by careful dollar, since his release. "What's going on?" Alexander asked. "Victoria's Foundation is hosting an anniversary gala next month," Daniel said. 10 years since its founding. It's going to be enormous, Alexander. Bigger than the Liberty Crown Gala, from what I'm hearing. They're renovating the entire east wing of the Metropolitan for it. Alexander felt something complicated stir in his chest, equal parts admiration and old familiar ache. "That's wonderful," he said, and meant it completely. "There's more," Daniel continued. "They released the guest list today. Alexander, your name is on it." Alexander sat down slowly on the edge of his small couch, phone pressed tight against his ear. "That has to be a mistake." "I called to confirm," Daniel said. "It's not a mistake. Victoria's team specifically included you." Alexander sat in silence for a long moment, memories of that first devastating gala flooding back with startling clarity. The shattered champagne glass, the staircase, the woman he barely recognized descending it, the slow, methodical collapse of everything he'd once believed defined him. "Why would she invite me?" he asked quietly, mostly to himself. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But if I were you, I'd find out." The weeks leading up to the gala passed with an anxious anticipation Alexander hadn't experienced in years. He found himself, almost embarrassingly, standing in front of his closet the night before, trying to decide what a man like him wore to an event like this now. Not the custom-tailored suits of his old life, long since sold or donated, but something honest, something that reflected who he'd actually become rather than who he used to perform being. He settled on a simple charcoal suit, well-made but unremarkable, purchased for his sister's wedding 2 years earlier. It felt right. It felt like him. The Metropolitan's East Wing, when he arrived, took his breath away in a manner entirely different from the extravagance of the Liberty Crown Gala years earlier. Where that first event had dazzled with excess, this one radiated purpose. Enormous banners along the walls displaying photographs of families the foundation had helped, testimonials printed in elegant script beside images of rebuilt homes, graduated students, small businesses launched from nothing. Alexander moved through the crowd quietly, recognizing almost no one, a stranger in a world he once dominated completely. He didn't mind the anonymity. There was something freeing in it, something that let him simply observe rather than perform. "Alexander?" He turned to find Gerald Simmons approaching, older now, gray, threading through his hair, but smiling in a way that suggested genuine warmth rather than obligation. "Gerald," Alexander said, extending his hand, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Victoria invited me too," Gerald said. "Turns out she's been quietly tracking everyone whose lives got tangled up in that whole mess, making sure people landed on their feet." "How's the accounting firm?" Alexander asked. "Made partner last year," Gerald said proudly. "My daughter starts college in the fall, business degree if you can believe it. Says she wants to make sure companies never do what we did." Alexander felt a swell of complicated pride, gratitude, and lingering guilt all tangled together. "That's remarkable, Gerald. I'm genuinely happy for you." "You look well," Gerald said, studying him carefully. "Different from the last time I saw you. Lighter, somehow." "I think I finally figured out how to carry things properly," Alexander said, instead of pretending I wasn't carrying them at all. They talked for a while longer, catching up on years of separate rebuilding, before Gerald excused himself to find his wife across the crowded room. Alexander continued moving through the gala alone, sampling the quiet, understated elegance of an event built around genuine purpose rather than performative wealth. He found Victoria near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers exactly as she had been 10 years earlier, though something about her had settled into an even deeper, more comfortable confidence with time. She wore a deep emerald gown this time, elegant but understated, her hair pulled back in a simple, sophisticated style that suited the woman she'd become, rather than the image anyone else might have expected of her. She caught his eye across the room, and for a moment, neither of them moved, memory and years of separate growth passing silently between them. Then she smiled, genuine and warm, and made her way toward him. "You came," she said. "You invited me," Alexander replied. "I couldn't imagine not coming." "How have you been, Alexander?" she asked, and something in her tone suggested she genuinely wanted to know, not simply as pleasant small talk, but as authentic curiosity about a man she'd once shared an entire life with. "Good," he said. "Really good, actually. The accounting firm promoted me to head the new financial literacy division last year. We're partnering with 3 different prison systems now, helping people prepare for release the way I wish someone had prepared me." "I heard about that," Victoria said. "Daniel mentioned it during one of our foundation's collaborative meetings. Your program's outcomes have been remarkable." "You collaborate with Daniel?" Alexander asked, surprised. "The Phoenix Foundation partners with several organizations doing meaningful re-entry work," Victoria said. "When Daniel mentioned your program specifically, I recognized the approach immediately. Practical financial education instead of theoretical lectures. Real accountability instead of performative guilt." Alexander felt something warm bloom in his chest, an unexpected pride at hearing his work described so precisely, so understood, by the one person whose opinion had always mattered most to him. "I learned that approach from watching how you rebuilt your own life," he admitted. "Practical steps, real accountability, no performance necessary." Victoria studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. "Walk with me," she said. "There's something I want to show you." She led him through the crowded ballroom toward a quieter corridor lined with framed photographs documenting the Foundation's decade of growth. Near the end of the corridor, she stopped before a specific photograph, gesturing for him to look closer. It was a picture of a young woman, perhaps 25, standing proudly in front of a small bakery, an enormous grin lighting up her face. "This is Maria," Victoria said. "She came to our financial literacy program 4 years ago, right after leaving an abusive marriage with absolutely nothing except 2 children and a suitcase of clothes." Alexander felt his chest tighten at the familiar image, the echo of his own cruelty reflected uncomfortably in someone else's devastating story. "We helped her rebuild her credit, secure a small business loan, and start this bakery," Victoria continued. "Last month, she opened her 2nd location." "That's extraordinary," Alexander said quietly. "There are thousands of stories like hers," Victoria said. "Thousands of people who discovered, the same way I did, that devastating loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes it's simply the painful beginning of an entirely different one." She turned to face him directly, her expression softening into something Alexander hadn't seen from her since long before their divorce. "I wanted you to see this," she said, "because I think you needed to understand something clearly. This foundation, everything it's built, everything it's accomplished, it exists because of what happened between us, not despite it." "I don't understand," Alexander said. "If you hadn't thrown me away that night," Victoria said carefully, "I never would have discovered exactly how capable I was of building something extraordinary from nothing. I might have spent my entire life quietly supporting someone else's ambitions instead of finally pursuing my own." Alexander absorbed her words slowly, something shifting inside him, a reframing of years of guilt he'd carried since that devastating night at the Liberty Crown Gala. "That doesn't excuse what I did," he said. "No," Victoria agreed, "it doesn't. What you did was cruel and dismissive and genuinely harmful. But I've learned something important over these past 10 years, Alexander. Pain doesn't have to remain purely destructive. Sometimes, if we're brave enough and honest enough, we can transform it into something that ultimately helps far more people than it originally hurt." "Is that what you've done?" Alexander asked. "Transformed what happened between us into something meaningful?" "That's exactly what I've done," Victoria said. "And watching you build your own version of that transformation, watching you take responsibility instead of hiding from it, watching you help other people avoid the mistakes we both made, that matters to me, Alexander, more than I expected it to." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment. 10 years of separate growth, separate devastation, separate rebuilding, finally converging into something that felt, for the first time since that shattered champagne glass, genuinely peaceful between them. "Can I ask you something?" Alexander said finally. "Of course." "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. "The years we spent together, before everything fell apart? Or does all of that feel like wasted time now, looking back?" Victoria considered the question seriously, taking her time before answering. "I used to think it was wasted time," she admitted. "For a long time after the divorce, I resented every year I'd spent supporting your ambitions instead of building my own. But eventually, I realized something important." "What's that?" "Everything I learned during those years, the contract negotiations, the financial strategy, the patience required to build something complicated and lasting, all of that became the exact foundation I needed to build the Phoenix Foundation successfully. Nothing was wasted, Alexander. It was simply misdirected for a while before I finally redirected it towards something that mattered." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding settling over him with quiet, unexpected comfort. "I'm grateful for that perspective," he said. "I spent years believing I'd simply destroyed everything good between us. It helps, hearing that some of it became something meaningful instead. Some of the best things in my life grew directly from the worst thing that ever happened to me," Victoria said. "That's not an excuse for what you did, but it is, I think, an important truth about resilience." The gala continued around them, distant music and laughter drifting through the quiet corridor where they stood. But Alexander felt entirely present in this singular moment, more connected to genuine truth than he'd felt during any of the 1,000 extravagant parties he'd attended during his years running Whitmore Global. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything, for the consequences that forced me to change, for the invitation tonight, for showing me this photograph, and helping me understand something important about how pain can eventually become purpose." Victoria smiled, genuine warmth radiating from an expression that no longer carried any trace of the anger or hurt she'd once, understandably, harbored toward him. "We should probably rejoin the gala," she said. "I have a speech to give in 20 minutes. "Of course," Alexander said. "I don't want to keep the Queen of the Phoenix Foundation from her kingdom." Victoria laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound Alexander hadn't heard from her in over a decade. "That title was always a bit dramatic," she said. "I much prefer simply being called Victoria these days." "Victoria," Alexander repeated softly. "Suits you far better than any title ever could." They walked back toward the main ballroom together, not as former spouses carrying years of painful history, but as two people who had each, separately and through vastly different journeys, discovered exactly what genuine integrity required and finally built lives worthy of that understanding. Victoria's speech that evening moved the entire room to a standing ovation, her voice carrying the same quiet strength Alexander remembered from that first devastating night years earlier, though now infused with something even more powerful, genuine peace, earned through a decade of transforming devastating loss into extraordinary purpose. 10 years ago, she told the packed ballroom, I stood in a similar room, having just discovered that everything I believed defined my worth had been stripped away in a single cruel moment. I want you to know something important tonight, something I wish someone had told me back then. She paused, scanning the crowd with the same calm composure that had once frozen Alexander completely in place. Your worth was never dependent on someone else's recognition of it, she said. It never disappears simply because another person fails to see it clearly. Sometimes the person who discards you is doing you the unexpected favor of finally setting you free to discover exactly how extraordinary you're capable of becoming. Applause thundered through the ballroom, and Alexander clapped along with everyone else, no longer the devastated man who had once stood frozen at the edge of a similar crowd years earlier, but someone genuinely proud, genuinely grateful, genuinely at peace with the complicated, difficult journey that had brought him to this exact moment. After the speech concluded, as guests began mingling once more, Alexander found himself approached by a young woman he didn't immediately recognize. Mr. Whitmore? She asked. I'm not sure if you remember me. I attended your financial literacy symposium a few years ago, right after my release. Alexander studied her face, memory slowly surfacing. Jasmine, right? You asked about starting a business after incarceration. Her face lit up with surprise. You remember? Of course I remember, Alexander said. How did everything turn out? I opened a small landscaping business 2 years ago, Jasmine said proudly. Started with just me and one truck. Now I've got 6 employees, half of them also formerly incarcerated, giving them the same chance somebody gave me. Alexander felt tears unexpectedly threatening at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the quiet, unglamorous, entirely genuine impact of work he'd once considered far beneath the ambitious billionaire he used to believe himself destined to become. That's the most meaningful thing anyone's told me in years, he said honestly. I wanted to thank you, Jasmine said. Your speech that day about honest work mattering more than impressive titles, it changed how I thought about starting over. I'm grateful you were willing to share something that difficult so publicly. Alexander thought about that conversation long after Jasmine returned to the crowd, long after the gala eventually wound down, long after he found himself walking alone through quiet Manhattan streets toward the subway station that would carry him back to his modest apartment in Queens. He thought about the version of himself who had once believed only enormous wealth and public admiration could constitute a meaningful life. He thought about the devastating collapse that had stripped away every illusion he'd built his entire identity around. He thought about 18 months of quiet reflection, about honest work that mattered without anyone watching, about Gerald's forgiveness and Jasmine's gratitude and Victoria's hard-won peace. He understood now, walking alone through streets that had once felt like his personal kingdom, that the man he used to be would have considered tonight's gala, this entire chapter of his life, an unmitigated failure. Small apartment, entry-level career, no wealth or status worth mentioning at dinner parties he no longer attended. But the man he'd become understood something entirely different. He understood that genuine worth had never required an audience. He understood that real success looked far less like champagne fountains and designer gowns, and far more like Jasmine's landscaping trucks, Gerald's daughter studying business ethics, Maria's second bakery location, and thousands of quiet, unglamorous victories the Phoenix Foundation had helped make possible. He understood, finally and completely, exactly what Victoria had tried to teach him years earlier, back when he'd been too arrogant and too blind to listen. Some of the most extraordinary things in life grow directly from the wreckage of devastating loss, if you're brave enough to do the difficult, unglamorous work of genuine transformation instead of simply performing contrition for whoever happens to be watching. Alexander Whitmore had lost his empire, his reputation, his marriage, and years of his freedom. But somewhere in the quiet, painful process of rebuilding everything from nothing, he had finally discovered something infinitely more valuable than anything he'd possessed during his years as a billionaire CEO. He had discovered who he actually was beneath every layer of wealth and status and performance he'd once mistaken for genuine identity. And that man, flawed and humbled and finally honest, was someone Alexander Whitmore was genuinely, unexpectedly proud to have become. The story, in the end, was never really about revenge or downfall or even redemption in the traditional sense. It was about the simple, difficult truth that real worth, the kind that survives devastating loss, public humiliation, and complete reconstruction from nothing, was never about being seen by others. It was about becoming, quietly and consistently, someone genuinely worth being. And in that final hard-won understanding, both Alexander and Victoria had each, separately, and through entirely different journeys, finally found exactly what they were always searching for. Not each other, not revenge, not redemption from anyone else's judgment, just the quiet, unshakable peace of finally becoming who they were always meant to be.